Clara stood at the edge of the crowded church, her heart heavy with grief. The room buzzed with quiet murmurs and sniffles. But to Clara, it felt like a distant hum. Her father, Thomas, was gone, just like that, without warning. One moment he had been laughing at the breakfast table, teasing her about her messy hair, and the next, he was lying motionless in a hospital bed. A sudden heart attack had stolen him away, leaving behind an emptiness that seemed impossible to fill. The coffin sat center stage, draped in white lilies. It looked too small to hold someone as big as her dad, not just in size, but in presence. He had always been larger than life to her, whether it was fixing her bike when she was little or staying up late to help her study for exams. Thomas had been her anchor. Now, staring at the polished wood of the casket, Clara couldn't wrap her mind around the fact that he was inside, silent and still. Her legs felt like lead as she walked toward the coffin. Every step weighed on her, each breath harder than the last. Relatives patted her shoulder as she passed, offering soft condolences. "He's in a better place now," they said. But those words meant nothing to Clara. All she could think about was how unfair it was, that she wouldn't hear his laugh again, or feel his bare hugs after a bad day. When she finally reached the coffin, tears blurred her vision. She hesitated, her hands trembling. The lid was closed, which made it worse somehow. At least if she could see his face one last time, she might find some closure. But this felt final, overwhelming, unbearable. Without thinking, Clara leaned forward and wrapped her arms around the cold, hard surface of the coffin. She pressed her cheek against it, wishing more than anything that she could break through and hold him just one more time. Her sobs echoed in the quiet church, raw and unfiltered. She didn't care who heard or what they thought. In that moment, all she wanted was her dad back. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to picture him the way he used to be. His warm smile, his twinkling eyes, the way he ruffled her hair even when she complained. But no matter how hard she tried, the image kept slipping away, replaced by the unbearable reality of his absence. As she clung to the coffin, something strange stirred within her. It started as a faint, tingling sensation, almost like static electricity brushing against her skin. Then the air around her seemed to shift. The hushed whispers of the mourners faded into silence, and the weight of her sorrow began to lift ever so slightly. For a brief second, Clara wondered if she was imagining things. Grief could do that, right? Make you feel things that weren't really there. But then something happened that she couldn't explain. Out of nowhere, she felt warmth, a comforting, familiar touch that sent shivers down her spine. It wasn't possible. Her father was inside the sealed coffin. Yet there it was, a hand gently resting over hers, as real as the pounding of her own heart. And just as suddenly, a voice whispered her name. Clara. The sound was soft, barely audible, but it jolted her like lightning. Her eyes flew open, and for a fleeting moment, she forgot where she was. Or maybe she wasn't there at all anymore. Whatever was happening, it defied logic, reason, and everything she thought she knew about life and death. As Clara felt the warmth of that impossible touch, her breath caught in her throat. The church, once filled with the quiet murmurs of mourners and the faint rustle of clothing, had fallen eerily silent. It was as though the world itself had paused, holding its breath alongside her. She could no longer hear the soft sobs of her mother or the distant shuffle of feet. Even the ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to have stopped. Everything around her faded into a blur, leaving only the sensation of that hand on hers and the sound of her own racing heartbeat. Clara's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this grief playing tricks on her? Had the weight of losing her father pushed her into some kind of hallucination? But the warmth was too real, too vivid to be imagined. It wasn't just a fleeting feeling. It lingered, steady and comforting, like the embrace she had so desperately craved moments ago. And then came the voice again, softer this time, but unmistakable. Clara. Her eyes widened as she pulled back slightly, glancing around the room. Everyone else seemed frozen in place, their expressions caught mid-motion. Her aunt stood with a tissue halfway to her face, her lips parted as if about to speak. A cousin near the front pew was frozen in the act of adjusting his tie. Even the priest at the altar appeared statuesque, his Bible clutched tightly in one hand. It was as though time itself had been suspended, leaving Clara alone in this strange, surreal moment. Before she could process any of it, the air around her began to shimmer, like heat waves rising from asphalt on a summer day. The edges of the church dissolved into a soft, golden light, and the heavy wooden pews faded away entirely. Clara blinked, unsure whether to panic or marvel at what was unfolding before her. Her grip tightened instinctively on the edge of the coffin, except it wasn't a coffin anymore. Instead, she found herself standing in a vast, open meadow bathed in sunlight. The grass beneath her feet was impossibly green, dotted with wildflowers of every color. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh earth and blooming flowers, wrapping around her like a warm blanket. And then she saw him. Standing a few feet away was her father, Thomas, alive and smiling just as she remembered him. He wore his favorite plaid shirt, the one he always said made him look handsome enough to charm the birds out of the trees. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his eyes sparkled with the same kindness and mischief that had always made her laugh. For a moment, Clara thought she might collapse under the weight of her emotions. Her knees wobbled, and tears streamed down her cheeks as she took a hesitant step forward. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Thomas smiled wider, nodding gently. "It's me, sweetheart," he said, his voice rich and familiar, like the melody of an old song she hadn't heard in years. "I'm here." Clara wanted to run to him, to throw her arms around him, and never let go. But something held her back, a mix of disbelief and awe. This couldn't be real. Could it? Her father was gone. She had seen the coffin, attended the funeral, felt the crushing finality of loss. Yet here he was, standing in front of her, looking as alive as ever. "How?" she stammered, unable to form a complete sentence. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions, each one tumbling over the next. How was this possible? Where were they? Was she dreaming? Thomas raised a hand, gesturing for her to calm down. "Shut, Clara," he said softly. "There's so much I want to tell you, but we don't have much time. You need to listen carefully." The urgency in his tone snapped her out of her daze. She nodded quickly, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. Whatever was happening, she didn't want to waste a single second of it. If this truly was her father, if this was her chance to see him one last time, she would cling to it with everything she had. Clara's heart pounded as she stared at her father, standing there in the middle of the glowing meadow. It felt surreal, like stepping into a dream where the impossible became real. Yet, despite the strangeness of it all, there was something undeniably comforting about his presence. His smile was warm, and his eyes held the same love and wisdom she had always known. For a moment, she forgot to question how or why this was happening. All that mattered was that he was here. Thomas took a step closer, his movements steady and deliberate. "Clara," he began, his voice soft but firm, "I know you're confused, and I don't blame you. This isn't something anyone can easily understand. But what you need to know is that our bond, it's stronger than anything else. Love like ours doesn't just disappear when someone passes on." She tilted her head, trying to process his words. "But you're gone," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're supposed to be." She couldn't bring herself to say the word dead. It felt too final, too cruel, especially now that he was standing right in front of her. He nodded gently, acknowledging her pain. "Yes, my time in your world has ended. But that doesn't mean I'm truly gone. There's more to life and death than what we see, Clara. What you're experiencing now is proof of that. It's rare, though. Not everyone gets a chance like this. You do because you have such a pure heart, and because our connection means everything." Clara swallowed hard, tears streaming down her face again. "Does this mean You'll stay. Can you come back with me? Her father's expression softened, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. Oh, sweetheart, I wish I could. But this moment, it's a gift, not a forever thing. The rules of life and death are written for a reason. My place is here now, and yours is back in the living world. That's where you belong. The thought of losing him again tore at her chest, but deep down, she understood. Still, she couldn't help asking, then why am I here? Why did you bring me to this place? Thomas reached out, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Because you needed to hear something important, he said. Something only I can tell you. He paused, searching her face as if committing every detail to memory. Life is hard, Clara. It throws challenges at us that sometimes feel unbearable. Losing someone you love, that's one of the hardest things anyone can go through. But even in the darkest moments, there's light if you look for it. She listened intently, hanging on to every word. This was her father talking, the man who had always been her guide, her rock. If anyone could make sense of the chaos swirling inside her, it was him. You've got so much ahead of you, he continued. Dreams to chase, people to help, lives to touch. Don't let grief hold you back. Use it instead to grow stronger, kinder, braver. And remember, no matter where I am, I'll always be watching over you. Always. His words sank in slowly, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. For the first time since his passing, Clara felt a flicker of hope, a tiny spark that maybe, just maybe, she could find her way through the darkness. But before she could respond, Thomas glanced over his shoulder, as if sensing something she couldn't see. Our time is almost up, he said quietly. You'll wake soon, and this will feel like a distant memory. But trust me, Clara, it happened. Every second of it. And I'll never be far from you. Her breath hitched, panic rising in her chest. No, please don't go yet, she pleaded, reaching for him. But already, the golden meadow was beginning to fade, the colors blurring into soft hues. Her father's figure grew fainter, though his smile remained unwavering. I love you, Clara, he said, his voice echoing softly. More than you'll ever know. And then, with a flash of light, the meadow vanished, leaving Clara clutching empty air. When Clara opened her eyes again, the golden meadow was gone, and she found herself back in the quiet stillness of the church. For a fleeting moment, she wondered if everything had been a dream, a beautiful, vivid hallucination born out of her grief. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The warmth of her father's touch still lingered on her shoulder, and his words echoed in her mind like a gentle melody that refused to fade. Her father's voice had been so clear, so full of love and wisdom. He hadn't just come to comfort her. He had come to teach her. And now, as she stood there beside his coffin, those lessons began to take root in her heart. Thomas had spoken about life, not just surviving it, but truly living it. He told her stories from his own past, ones she'd never heard before, each one carrying a lesson meant to guide her forward. I wasn't always strong, he had admitted in the meadow, his tone soft but honest. There were days when I felt like giving up. When your grandmother passed away, I thought I'd never recover. I locked myself in my room for weeks, angry at the world, blaming myself for things I couldn't control. But then I realized something important, that life keeps moving, whether we're ready or not. Staying stuck in sadness doesn't honor the people we've lost. Living fully does. Clara remembered how intently she had listened, hanging on to every word. She had always seen her father as invincible, someone who never faltered. Hearing him talk about his struggles made her realize that everyone carries burdens, even those who seem strongest. It gave her courage to face her own pain without letting it define her. He went on to share another story, this one about a time when he was younger and working 2 jobs to support his family. There were nights when I came home exhausted, wondering if I could keep going, he said. But I did, because quitting wasn't an option. I learned that resilience isn't about being fearless. It's about pushing through even when you're scared. You don't have to be perfect, Clara. Just keep moving forward, one step at a time. His words struck a chord within her. Clara had spent the past few weeks feeling paralyzed by grief, unable to focus on school or anything else. Now she understood that while it was okay to feel sad, she couldn't let sorrow consume her entirely. Her father's strength hadn't come from avoiding hardship. It had come from facing it head-on, with faith and determination. Perhaps the most powerful lesson he shared was about kindness. "The world can be a tough place," he said, his eyes filled with sincerity. "People carry invisible scars, wounds you might not see. Be kind to them, Clara. Even a small act of compassion can change someone's day or their life. Don't underestimate the power of a smile, a listening ear, or simply being there for someone who needs it." As he spoke, Clara felt a shift inside her. His words weren't just advice. They were a call to action. He wanted her to live boldly, to embrace life with open arms, and to spread light wherever she went. She realized that in honoring his memory, she wasn't just keeping him alive in her heart. She was becoming the person he believed she could be. Before their time together ended, Thomas knelt slightly to look her directly in the eye. "Promise me something," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Promise me that no matter what happens, you'll find joy in the little things. Laugh often, love deeply, and don't waste a single moment worrying about what-ifs. Life is too short for regrets." Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I promise, Dad," she whispered. And though their meeting was brief, the impact of his words would stay with her forever, guiding her like a compass through the storms of life. The meadow was fading fast, its golden glow dimming like the last rays of sunlight at dusk. Clara could feel herself being pulled back to reality, but she wasn't ready, not yet. Her father's lessons were etched into her mind, each word carrying a weight that felt both comforting and daunting. She wanted to hold on to this moment forever, to stay in this space where she could see him, hear him, and feel his presence so vividly. But as much as she resisted, she knew it wasn't meant to last. Thomas must have sensed her reluctance because he reached out again, placing both hands on her shoulders. His touch was firm but gentle, grounding her even as everything around them began to blur. "Clara," he said, his voice steady despite the urgency in his tone, "you need to promise me something more." She blinked away tears, trying to focus on his face. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. He took a deep breath, his expression softening with love, but also resolve. "Promise me you'll live boldly. Don't let fear or sadness trap you. You've got so much ahead of you. Dreams waiting to unfold, people who need your light, moments that will take your breath away if you let them. Don't waste a single second hiding from life." Clara nodded slowly, though her heart ached at the thought of letting go. "I'll try," she whispered. "But how can I do all those things without you?" Her father smiled, his eyes twinkling with the same mischief she remembered from childhood. "You won't be without me," he assured her. "I'm not just in your memories, sweetheart. I'm in your heart. Every time you laugh, every time you help someone, every time you chase your dreams, I'll be there, cheering you on. And when you need guidance, just close your eyes and ask for me. I'll always find a way to reach you." His words sent a wave of warmth through her, easing some of the heaviness in her chest. It wasn't easy to imagine facing the world without him physically by her side, but knowing he'd still be with her in spirit gave her strength. Still, she couldn't shake the fear of forgetting. The fear that over time, his voice might grow fainter, his image less clear. As if reading her thoughts, Thomas added, "And don't worry about forgetting me. Love doesn't fade, Clara. Not real love. The bond we share, it's unbreakable. No matter how many years pass, no matter where life takes you, I'll always be a part of you. Trust in that." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she absorbed his words. They weren't just promises, they were lifelines. He was giving her tools to navigate the pain of loss while reminding her of the beauty life still held. She realized then that her grief didn't have to define her. It could coexist with hope, with joy, with purpose. That realization felt like stepping out of a dark room into sunlight after weeks of shadow. Before she could respond, Thomas glanced over his shoulder again, his smile tinged with bittersweetness. "Our time is almost up," he said softly. "But before you go, I want you to remember one more thing. You're stronger than you think, braver than you feel, and loved more than you'll ever know." With those final words, he pulled her into a tight hug. For a brief, precious moment, Clara felt the solidness of his arms around her, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against hers. She clung to him, wishing with all her might that she could freeze this instant and never let go. But as quickly as it came, the sensation began to slip away. The colors of the meadow dissolved into white light, and his figure grew fainter until only his voice remained, whispering one last promise. "I'll always be with you." When Clara opened her eyes again, she was back in the church, standing beside her father's coffin. The mourners around her were frozen in place, unaware of what had just transpired. To them, nothing unusual had happened, but to Clara, everything had changed. Her father's words echoed in her mind, planting seeds of courage, hope, and determination. She straightened her posture, wiped her tears, and made a silent vow to honor his memory by living the life he believed she was capable of. From that moment on, Clara carried his promise with her, a beacon of light guiding her through the darkest days. Clara blinked, her vision adjusting to the dim lighting of the church. The golden meadow and her father's voice felt like a distant memory now, slipping through her fingers like sand in an hourglass. But the warmth of his embrace lingered, a quiet reminder that what she had experienced was real, not just a fleeting dream or a trick of her mind. Slowly, she stepped back from the coffin, her hands trembling as they fell to her sides. The world around her snapped back into focus. The mourners were no longer frozen. They shifted uncomfortably in their seats, dabbing at their eyes with tissues or whispering condolences to one another. Time hadn't stopped for them. It had only paused for Clara. To everyone else, it seemed as though she had simply been standing there, lost in thought, clinging to the casket for longer than expected. No one could have guessed the extraordinary encounter she just had. Her mother approached first, her face pale and lined with grief. She placed a gentle hand on Clara's shoulder. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, concern etched into her features. Clara hesitated, unsure how to respond. How could she explain something she barely understood herself? Instead, she nodded faintly and forced a small smile. "I'm fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He's okay now." Her mother frowned slightly, clearly puzzled by the cryptic statement, but didn't press further. Instead, she pulled Clara into a hug, holding her tightly as if trying to shield her from the weight of their shared loss. Clara leaned into the embrace, drawing strength from her mother's presence, while silently vowing to be stronger for both of them. As the service continued, Clara found herself observing the people around her with new eyes. There was Aunt Susan, who always tried to lighten the mood with jokes, but whose red-rimmed eyes betrayed her sorrow. Uncle Mark sat stoically beside her, his jaw clenched as if fighting back tears. Even little Emma, Clara's 8-year-old cousin, looked unusually solemn, clutching a stuffed bunny her father had given her years ago. Each person carried their own version of grief, their own memories of Thomas. And yet, none of them truly knew the depth of Clara's connection to him, or the promise she had made. By the time the funeral ended and the crowd began to disperse, Clara felt a strange sense of calm settling over her. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was something close to peace. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "Live boldly, chase your dreams, spread kindness." She realized that honoring his memory meant more than crying over his absence. It meant stepping up and living the kind of life he would be proud of. That evening, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Clara replayed every detail of their meeting in the meadow. His smile, his stories, his advice. It all felt so vivid, as if he were still beside her, guiding her thoughts. She thought about the promises she had made, to live fully, to help others, to find joy even in the darkest moments. They weren't empty vows. They were lifelines, anchors that would keep her grounded when the waves of grief threatened to pull her under. The days that followed weren't easy. Grief doesn't vanish overnight, and Clara often found herself overwhelmed by sudden bursts of sadness. Walking past her father's favorite chair in the living room brought tears to her eyes. Hearing his favorite song on the radio made her chest tighten. Yet, amidst the pain, there were glimmers of hope. She started journaling, pouring her emotions onto paper as a way to process her feelings. She began volunteering at a local community center, helping kids with their homework, a task her father had always encouraged her to do because teaching others is the best way to learn. Slowly but surely, Clara noticed changes within herself. She became more patient, more empathetic. When friends confided in her about their struggles, she listened without judgment, offering comfort and support. At school, she threw herself into projects and extracurricular activities, determined to make the most of every opportunity. Teachers remarked on her newfound determination, and classmates admired her resilience. But perhaps the biggest change was inside her. Where once there had been despair, there was now purpose. Clara carried her father's lessons with her everywhere she went, letting them shape her actions and decisions. Every act of kindness, every moment of laughter, every step forward felt like a tribute to him. Though he was no longer physically present, his influence remained undeniable, a quiet force pushing her toward a brighter future. And whenever doubt crept in, whenever the weight of loss felt unbearable, Clara closed her eyes and whispered his name. In those moments, she could almost feel his hand on her shoulder, steadying her, reminding her that she wasn't alone. Months passed, and Clara's life began to transform in ways she never expected. The pain of losing her father didn't disappear. It lingered like a soft ache that occasionally surfaced when she least expected it. But instead of letting grief consume her, Clara channeled it into action. She threw herself into everything she did with a newfound sense of purpose, determined to honor the promises she had made to her father during their extraordinary meeting. At school, Clara became the student everyone admired, not because she was perfect, but because she worked hard and uplifted those around her. In group projects, she encouraged quieter classmates to share their ideas, reminding them that their voices mattered. During basketball practice, she cheered on teammates who struggled, helping them improve without ever making them feel small. Even teachers noticed the change in her demeanor. Clara's got this light about her, one remarked to another after class. She makes people believe they can do better. Outside of academics, Clara found joy in volunteering at the community center, a place her father had always loved visiting. On weekends, she helped kids with their homework, just as he had encouraged her to do. At first, she worried she wouldn't be good enough, that she might fail them somehow. But then she remembered his words. You don't have to be perfect. Just show up and try your best. With that thought in mind, she approached each child with patience and kindness, celebrating their progress no matter how small. One particular boy, Ethan, stood out to her. He was shy and hesitant, often keeping his head down during sessions. When Clara asked him what was wrong, he admitted that he felt like he'd never be smart enough to make his parents proud. Her heart broke for him, and she knelt beside his chair, looking him straight in the eye. Ethan, she said firmly but gently, you are already amazing just by being you. Don't let anyone, including yourself, tell you otherwise. You've got so much potential, and I believe in you. Over time, Ethan began opening up, his confidence growing with every session. By the end of the semester, he proudly showed Clara an A-grade paper he'd written, grinning from ear to ear. Seeing his happiness filled Clara with a warmth she hadn't felt in months. It reminded her of the way her father used to beam whenever she accomplished something, even if it was as simple as tying her shoelaces for the first time. Clara also started journaling regularly, writing letters to her father as a way to process her emotions and keep his memory alive. Some entries were short and sweet, recounting funny moments or milestones she wished he could witness. Others were raw and honest, pouring out her fears and frustrations. Through these pages, she kept her connection to him strong, imagining his responses in her mind. "Keep going, sweetheart," she could almost hear him say. "You're doing great." Her transformation didn't go unnoticed. Friends who had seen her spiral into despair after her father's death now marveled at how radiant she seemed. They nicknamed her the girl with the light, though none of them knew the true source of her strength. To them, Clara simply exuded positivity and resilience, qualities that inspired others to face their own challenges head-on. But perhaps the most profound impact Clara had was on her mother. After Thomas's passing, her mom had withdrawn into herself, overwhelmed by loneliness and sorrow. Clara made it her mission to bring her back to life, little by little. She cooked meals together with her, played her favorite songs, and even convinced her to join a book club. Slowly, her mother began smiling again, finding solace in the bond they shared and the memories of Thomas they cherish. Through all of this, Clara held fast to her father's promise that he would always be with her. Whenever doubt crept in or sadness threatened to pull her under, she closed her eyes and whispered his name. Each time, she felt a flicker of warmth, a reassurance that he was still guiding her, cheering her on from wherever he was. Living boldly wasn't easy. It required courage, effort, and faith, but Clara embraced it wholeheartedly. Every act of kindness, every moment of laughter, every step forward felt like a tribute to her father. And though she missed him fiercely, she knew she wasn't alone. His love lived on through her, lighting the path ahead. Exactly 1 year after her father's passing, Clara stood alone in the quiet cemetery, the crisp autumn air brushing against her cheeks. The golden leaves swirled around her feet as she made her way to his grave, carrying a bouquet of white lilies, his favorite flowers. She had come here often over the past year, but today felt different. This wasn't just another visit. It was a milestone, a chance to reflect on everything she had been through and how far she had come. When she reached the headstone, she knelt down and placed the flowers gently at its base. Her fingers traced the engraved letters of his name, Thomas Bennett. For a moment, she simply sat there, letting the silence wrap around her like an old friend. Memories flooded back, the sound of his laughter, the warmth of his hugs, the way he always seemed to know exactly what to say when life felt overwhelming. A lump formed in her throat, but she didn't cry. Instead, she smiled softly, remembering all the ways he had shaped her into the person she was today. "You be proud of me, Dad," she whispered, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. "I'm trying my best to live boldly, just like you asked. I think I'm doing okay." As if answering her, a gentle breeze swept through the cemetery, rustling the leaves and sending a shiver down her spine. It wasn't cold. It felt comforting, almost like a hug. Clara paused, looking around. The wind carried with it the faint scent of his cologne, the same one he used to wear every day. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized this wasn't mere coincidence. It was him, a final sign, a reminder that he was still with her. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it, a single white feather resting on the grass near her feet. She blinked, unsure if she was imagining things, but when she leaned closer, the feather was undeniably real, soft, pristine, and glowing faintly in the sunlight. Clara picked it up carefully, holding it between her fingers as tears welled up in her eyes. "Thank you," she murmured, clutching the feather to her chest. "I'll keep going, I promise." In that moment, Clara understood something profound. Grief wasn't about forgetting or moving on. It was about carrying love forward. Her father wasn't truly gone. He lived on in the lessons he had taught her, in the kindness she shared with others, and in the strength she found within herself during the hardest times. His presence was woven into the fabric of her life, invisible yet undeniable. Over the next few weeks, Clara kept the feather tucked safely inside a small glass jar on her bedside table. Every time she looked at it, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, She continued volunteering at the community center, helping kids like Ethan discover their potential. She stayed close to her mother, ensuring neither of them ever felt alone. And she pursued her dreams with unwavering determination, knowing her father would be cheering her on every step of the way. Life wasn't perfect, it never would be. But Clara had learned to find beauty even in its imperfections. She laughed more, loved deeply, and embraced each day with gratitude. Whenever doubt crept in, she closed her eyes and imagined her father's voice, steady and reassuring. "You're stronger than you think, braver than you feel, and loved more than you'll ever know." Years later, when people asked Clara how she managed to stay so hopeful after such a devastating loss, she would smile and tell them about the feather. "It's proof," she'd say, her voice filled with conviction, "that love doesn't end with death. It transcends it." And deep down, she knew the truth. Her father hadn't left her. He was right where he had always been, in her heart, guiding her light.